Hook, that night, something happened that wasn't in the script, and Johnny Carson couldn't look away. The Tonight Show studio in Burbank held 450 seats, but on this particular evening in 1974, it felt smaller. The air conditioning hummed steadily as it always did, fighting against the heat of the stage lights that burned white-hot above Johnny Carson's desk. The audience had already laughed through the monologue. Ed McMahon had already delivered his trademark chuckle at precisely the right moments. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. But in the green room, 20 feet from the stage entrance, something was different. Muhammad Ali sat in a chair that seemed too small for him, his frame relaxed but his eyes sharp. He wore a dark suit, crisp and tailored, the kind that photographers loved because it caught the light in all the right ways. His hands rested on his knees, fingers occasionally tapping a rhythm only he could hear. He'd been on The Tonight Show 11 times before. He knew the format, he knew the beats, he knew when Johnny would lean forward, when the audience would react, when to pause for effect. What he didn't know was that someone in that studio audience had come specifically for him, not to admire, not to celebrate, to challenge. The stage manager gave the 2-minute warning. Ali stood, rolled his shoulders once, and walked toward the curtain. His footsteps were soundless on the industrial carpet. Behind him, a production assistant adjusted her headset and spoke quietly into the microphone clipped to her collar. The show was running on schedule. Everything was normal. Everything appeared normal. Johnny finished his setup for the next segment, his voice smooth and practiced. The audience was primed. They knew who was coming. When Johnny said the name Muhammad Ali, the applause began before he'd even finished the syllable. It rolled through the studio like thunder, building and building until the curtain parted and Ali stepped into the light. He moved the way he always moved, confident, loose, playing to every corner of the room at once. He waved, he smiled. He pointed at someone in the front row who'd stood up. The audience fed off his energy, and their energy fed back into him. This was the rhythm of television, the exchange that made live broadcast feel electric. Johnny rose from behind his desk, extending his hand. They shook. Ali said something that made Johnny laugh. The cameras didn't catch it, but the audience did, and they laughed too. They sat, the applause faded, and Johnny began. "You're in town for the press conference tomorrow," Johnny said, settling back into his chair with the ease of a man who'd conducted this particular dance thousands of times. "That's right, Johnny," Ali replied, his voice carrying that familiar cadence, the one that made even simple statements sound like the beginning of a poem. "Big fight coming up. The biggest. You always say that, because it's always true." The audience laughed. This was the Ali they'd come to see. Quick, clever, impossible to pin down. Johnny smiled, leaning forward slightly, his pen tapping against his desk in a rhythm that matched the pacing of the conversation. He asked about training. Ali talked about running at dawn, about his sparring partners, about the discipline required to stay sharp. He talked about it in a way that made it sound both grueling and effortless, a contradiction he'd mastered years ago. The segment was going well. Too well, perhaps. Because that's when the man in the audience stood up. He was in the third row, slightly to the left of center. Average height, stocky build, wearing a brown jacket that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this occasion. His face was flushed, not from heat but from something else, something that had been building inside him for longer than the taping, longer than the drive to Burbank, longer than the wait in line for tickets. "Ali," he said. His voice cut through the studio with surprising clarity. The laughter stopped. Not gradually, instantly. Ali turned his head toward the voice. So did Johnny. So did every camera operator, every producer, every audience member within earshot. The stage manager in the wings took a half step forward, her hand moving toward her headset, ready to signal security. But she didn't signal. Not yet. Because for just a moment, everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The man in the brown jacket didn't sit down. "You talk a lot," he said. His voice was steady now, louder. "About how great you are. About how you're the best. But you won't fight for your country." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, dense, with all the things nobody wanted to say on a late-night entertainment program meant to sell cars and soap and soft drinks. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't playful banter between host and guest. This was something else entirely, something rawer, and everyone in that studio felt it. Ali didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even shift in his chair. He simply looked at the man. And Johnny Carson, for perhaps the first time in his career on The Tonight Show, didn't know what to do. His hand, which had been tapping his pen against the desk, went still. His smile, that professional, cameras-are-rolling smile, remained on his face, but it changed somehow. The warmth leaked out of it. What remained was the shape of a smile without the substance. He glanced at the man in the audience, then at Ali, then at someone off camera, possibly a producer, possibly just into the middle distance where solutions to unsolvable problems were supposed to appear. Ed McMahon, seated to the side, leaned forward slightly. His laugh, that reliable instrument he'd wielded for years, was nowhere to be found. The man in the brown jacket wasn't finished. "You say you're brave," he continued. "You say you're a fighter, but you wouldn't go when you were called." His words hung in the air, accusatory and unshakable. Around him, other audience members began to react. Some shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Others stared, waiting. A woman 2 rows back put her hand over her mouth. A man in the front row crossed his arms, his jaw tight. Ali still hadn't spoken. The cameras were still rolling, and Johnny Carson understood in that moment that whatever happened next would define not just this segment, but possibly something larger, something about who could say what on his show, about what topics were permissible, about where the line between entertainment and reality actually existed. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Well, he started, but he didn't finish, because Ali raised one hand just slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed. But Johnny saw it, and he stopped talking. Ali turned in his chair, rotating his entire body to face the man in the brown jacket. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't performing. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been during the banter, quieter than anyone expected. "What's your name?" Ali asked. The man blinked. Whatever he'd expected, anger, dismissal, a shouting match, this wasn't it. "What?" he said. "Your name," Ali repeated. "What do they call you?" The man hesitated. Around him, the audience seemed to hold its breath. The stage lights hummed. Someone coughed, and it sounded like an explosion. "Robert," the man finally said. "Robert," Ali echoed, nodding slowly. "Okay, Robert, you said I won't fight for my country." "That's right. You think that makes me a coward." It wasn't a question. Robert didn't answer, but his jaw tightened, and that was answer enough. Ali leaned back in his chair. He looked at Robert for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Johnny, then at the audience, then back at Robert. "Let me ask you something, Robert," Ali said. "When you say my country, whose country do you mean?" The question landed softly, but it detonated. Robert's face flushed deeper. "What kind of question is that?" "A real one," Ali said. His voice still hadn't risen. "See, you and I, we live in the same place. Same land, same flag, I guess. But we don't live in the same country, Robert. We never have." Johnny Carson's pen fell from his hand. It clattered against the desk, a small sound that somehow carried through the entire studio. He didn't pick it up. "I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky," Ali continued. "You know Louisville, Robert?" Robert didn't answer. "Beautiful city," Ali said. "Got a river, got parks, got neighborhoods where black folks couldn't live, got schools we couldn't attend, got restaurants that wouldn't serve us, got a whole system built to remind us every single day that we weren't really part of the country. We were just in it." The audience was motionless. Some people were nodding, almost imperceptibly. Others stared straight ahead, their faces blank. The woman with her hand over her mouth had lowered it, but her expression hadn't changed. "Now, you want to talk about fighting," Ali said. "Let's talk about fighting. You know what my people have been fighting? Not in some jungle halfway across the world, right here. Fighting to vote, fighting to eat in a diner, fighting to send our kids to decent schools, fighting to walk down a street without somebody crossing to the other side. That's fighting, Robert. That's a war. And nobody gave us medals for it." Robert stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. "That's not—" "Let me finish," Ali said, and though his voice remained calm, something in it made Robert stop talking immediately. "You say I wouldn't go when I was called," Ali continued. "But here's the thing, Robert. The people who called me, the same people who wanted to send me off to fight, those were the same people who wouldn't let my daddy eat in their restaurants. The same people who made my mama sit in the back of the bus. The same people who looked at me and my brothers and saw something less than human. He paused. The silence stretched. So when they called me, Ali said, I asked a simple question. Why? Why should I go fight poor people in Vietnam who never called me names, who never denied me anything, who never did a single thing to me or my family? And you know what they told me, Robert? Robert didn't answer. He couldn't. They said it was my duty, Ali finished. My duty. To a country that didn't treat me like I was part of it until they needed bodies for a war. Johnny Carson sat completely still. His face revealed nothing, but his hands gripped the edge of his desk and his knuckles were white. Ed McMahon had stopped leaning forward. He'd stopped moving entirely. Ali wasn't finished. Now, I'm not saying I'm better than anybody, he said, his voice softening slightly. I'm not saying you're wrong for feeling how you feel. I'm just saying, you gotta understand where I'm coming from. You gotta understand that when you say country, you mean something different than what I mean. And maybe that's the real fight. Not in Vietnam, not in a boxing ring, but right here. The fight to make country mean the same thing for all of us. He turned back to face Johnny, letting the words settle over the studio like dust after a collapse. Robert stood there for another moment, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Then, slowly, he sat down. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked smaller. Confused, perhaps, or maybe just tired. Johnny exhaled, a long breath that the microphones barely caught. Well, he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. I don't think I can follow that. A few people in the audience laughed, but it was scattered, uncertain. The tension hadn't fully broken. It had just shifted. Ali smiled, but it wasn't his showman's smile. It was something quieter, sadder. You don't have to follow it, Johnny, he said. You just have to hear it. And Johnny Carson, who'd interviewed presidents and movie stars and comedians and musicians, who'd navigated 10,000 conversations with perfect timing and unshakable control, nodded slowly. I hear you, he said. The cameras kept rolling. The commercial break was still 2 minutes away. But something had changed in that studio. Something that couldn't be edited out or papered over with jokes. It was in the way people shifted in their seats, in the way the crew members in the wings glanced at each other, in the way Johnny's shoulders, always so straight and controlled, seemed to carry a different weight. Ali turned back to the audience. Anybody else got questions? He asked, and this time his grin was real, an offering of lightness after the heaviness. A few people laughed, genuinely this time. The tension eased, just slightly. But Robert, in the third row, didn't laugh. He stared at his hands, folded in his lap, and when the cameras panned across the audience a moment later, they didn't linger on him. The producers had made a choice, consciously or not, to move past that moment, to let the show return to what it was supposed to be. Johnny asked another question, something about training routines. Ali answered, slipping back into his familiar rhythm. The audience responded. The show went on, but it had been marked. When the segment ended and Ali stood to leave, the applause was different than it had been when he'd entered. It was slower, more thoughtful. Some people clapped enthusiastically, others clapped politely. A few didn't clap at all, their hands remaining still in their laps. Ali waved, flashed his signature grin, and disappeared behind the curtain. Johnny watched him go, then turned to the camera for the transition to commercial. His smile returned, the professional mask sliding back into place. But for just a fraction of a second, so brief that only the most attentive viewers might have noticed, he paused. His eyes flickered toward the spot where Robert had been sitting, then back to the camera. "We'll be right back," he said. The red light blinked off. In the green room, Ali sat back down in the same chair he'd occupied before the segment. A production assistant asked if he needed anything. Water, coffee, a moment alone. He shook his head, polite but distant. His hands rested on his knees again, fingers tapping that same silent rhythm. A few minutes later, Johnny Carson walked in. This was unusual. The host rarely visited the green room between segments. He had other guests to prepare for, other elements of the show to coordinate. But he came anyway, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Ali looked up. "You didn't have to do that," Johnny said. Ali tilted his head slightly. Do what? Answer him. You could have let security remove him. You could have made a joke, changed the subject. I would have helped. I know. Johnny stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at the man who'd just diffused a moment that could have exploded into something ugly, something career-damaging, something that would have been replayed and analyzed and weaponized for years. Why did you? Johnny asked. Ali was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because he needed to hear it. Did he, or did you need to say it? Ali smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe both. Johnny nodded slowly. He didn't have a response to that. No clever quip or practiced line. He just stood there, two men in a green room 20 feet from a stage where millions watched them perform versions of themselves that were both true and carefully constructed. Thank you, Johnny finally said. Ali waved a hand, dismissive. Don't thank me. I just said what was real. That's why I'm thanking you. The words hung there, simple and sincere. Then Johnny turned and left, returning to the controlled chaos of his show, where every minute was accounted for and every moment had a purpose. Ali sat alone for another few minutes. The production assistant returned, reminding him that his car was ready whenever he wanted to leave. He nodded, stood, and walked toward the exit. As he passed through the backstage area, he could hear the audience laughing at something Johnny had said. The show had moved on. The rhythm had returned. Everything was normal again. Except it wasn't. Because in living rooms across America, people were sitting on their couches, staring at their television sets, processing what they'd just witnessed. Some were angry at Ali, angry at Johnny for letting him speak, angry at the disruption of their entertainment. Others were thoughtful, turning the words over in their minds, considering perspectives they'd never been asked to consider before. A few were crying, though they couldn't quite articulate why. The Tonight Show would receive more mail about that segment than almost any other that year. Letters praising Ali's courage, letters condemning his disrespect, letters asking questions, letters refusing to watch ever again. Letters from veterans, letters from civil rights activists, letters from people who'd never written to a television show before but felt compelled to respond to something they couldn't quite name. Johnny read some of them. Not all, there were too many, but some. He didn't respond publicly. That wasn't his style. But in the weeks that followed, those who worked closely with him noticed subtle shifts. He asked different questions of certain guests. He let moments of silence stretch a little longer. He seemed, in ways that were hard to define, more willing to let his show become a space where real things could be said. And Ali? He continued fighting, in the ring and out of it. The press conference the next day went exactly as expected. He predicted victory, he entertained reporters, he performed the role of Muhammad Ali, heavyweight champion, as he'd done countless times before. But years later, when asked about his appearances on The Tonight Show, he'd sometimes mention that night. Not by date, not by citing what was said, but by describing a feeling. Johnny let me be real, he'd say. That's rare. On television, everybody wants you to be the version of yourself they already know. But that night, Johnny let me be something else. Let me be honest. What he didn't mention, what maybe he didn't fully recognize, was that Johnny hadn't really had a choice. When Robert stood up and issued his challenge, the script had been torn up. The careful construction of entertainment had been breached. And in that moment, Johnny had made a decision. To step back, to let something authentic unfold, to risk his show becoming something messier and more complicated than it was supposed to be. That was the real shock, perhaps. Not Ali's response, which was eloquent and measured and entirely consistent with who he'd always been, but Johnny's silence. His willingness to cede control, to let his stage become a platform for something he couldn't predict or manage. In the control booth that night, after the show ended and the audience had filed out and the crew had begun breaking down the set, the director sat reviewing footage. He marked certain segments for editing, flagged moments that needed adjusting. When he reached the Ali segment, he stopped. His assistant, standing behind him, asked, "Are we cutting any of that?" The director watched the exchange again on the monitor. Ali's calm responses, Robert's rigid posture, Johnny's unusual stillness, the audience's collective held breath. "No," he said finally, "we're not cutting anything." "You sure? It's controversial." "I know." could get complaints. We'll get complaints either way. The assistant nodded, made a note on her clipboard, and moved on to the next segment. But the director sat there a moment longer, watching the frozen image of Muhammad Ali on the screen, mid-sentence. His hand raised slightly as he made a point that transcended boxing, transcended entertainment, transcended the carefully maintained boundaries of what late-night television was supposed to be. The footage aired exactly as it had been recorded. The complaints came as predicted, so did the praise, so did the think pieces and the editorials and the water cooler conversations that lasted longer than the segment itself. But here's what nobody saw. 3 weeks after the broadcast, a letter arrived at the Tonight Show offices. It was addressed to Muhammad Ali, care of the show. The return address was somewhere in Ohio. No name, just an address. A production assistant opened it, as was protocol. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in careful block letters. "You were right. I didn't understand. I'm trying to now. Thank you, Robert." The assistant passed it along to Johnny's office. Johnny read it, folded it carefully, and put it in his desk drawer. He never mentioned it on air, never referenced it in interviews, but he kept it. And sometimes, late at night after a show, when the studio was empty and the lights were dimmed and the echo of laughter had faded, he'd take it out and read it again. A reminder that television, for all its artifice and construction, could occasionally become a space where real understanding happened, where challenges were met not with dismissal, but with honesty, where the performance stopped and the person remained. That's what shocked Johnny Carson. Not that Ali spoke the truth. He'd always done that. But that the truth, spoken clearly and calmly on a stage designed for laughs and applause, could actually reach someone, could actually change something. The man in the brown jacket came looking for a fight. Instead, he got an education. And Johnny Carson, veteran of 1,000 polished conversations, learned that sometimes the best thing a host can do is stop hosting, stop steering, stop controlling, and just let something real happen, even if it makes everyone uncomfortable, even if it doesn't fit the format, even if it risks everything the show is supposed to be. Because occasionally, rarely, what the show is supposed to be isn't as important as what it could become in a single unscripted moment when a man stands up, issues a challenge, and another man responds not with anger, but with an invitation to see the world differently. That night, 450 people sat in a studio in Burbank. Millions more watched from their living rooms. And for a few minutes, entertainment became something else entirely, something necessary, something true. The cameras rolled, the words were spoken, and nobody, not the man in the brown jacket, not Johnny Carson, not the audience, not the viewers at home, walked away unchanged. That's what happened when someone challenged Muhammad Ali on live television. Not a fight, a revelation, and the shock wasn't in the confrontation, it was in the response. Calm, measured, undeniable. The kind of truth that doesn't need volume to be heard.